And we're back. So without further ado, giving the stage, shall I say, to Yash, Yash Agarwal. For those who don't know Yash, Yash is a Microsoft MVP. And I'm sure he's going to introduce himself as well. But he is someone who's very avidly addressing more of the pro code aspects and the more architectural and development approaches to the Power Platform, in addition to the low code approach. So without further ado, Yash, please take her away.
Thank you so much, Raz. So I'll quickly start sharing my screen. Please let me know when you can see it.
Yes.
So I'm sharing my PPT right now. So I hope we are all on the same page.
Yeah.
All right. So hey everyone, I hope you've been enjoying the session so far in the day and have learned something new. In this session, I'll be talking about data flows in CDS. We'll be covering some basic stuff like why CDS is important and how it can be used as a centralized data source, where you can consider the CDS as a single source of truth, and all your data from various different data sources can live in there, and you can build applications on the top of it. You can analyze the data better from that particular place, and carry out more analytics and things like that. So let's get started. A quick introduction on myself. So I'm Yash Agarwal, and I'm a Microsoft Business Applications MVP. I'm also a software developer right now working in India, and I'm one of the Flownots and Astronauts community members on the Power communities. And I've recently launched my blog bythedevs.com, where I like to blog about things that can be achieved using the Power platform. So please feel free to connect me with there. Talking about the session today, data and apps. So basically, you can build an application using Power Apps or any other tool basing your data source on either SQL or Excel or SharePoint, or maybe a file stored on OneDrive, and then on-prem data access, and so many other things. But at the end of the day, if you wanted to build a centralized location where you want to access all of this data from one place and build an app on the top of it, or visualize that in a better way, you can use CDS for that. And to sync that data into CDS, we have a lot of other methods as well. But in this session, we'll be focusing on data flows and how you can use data flows to sync back all the data from these multiple data sources and put that all into one place. So why CDS? Basically, you can consider CDS as a single source of truth for data, and you can bring data from across all data sources, including on-prem data over here. And CDS also provides a lot of functionality such that it allows you to implement role-based security on each of the table, which is called as an entity in CDS, and each single record or each single field. And then it has this capability that it offers, that you can integrate it with multiple other data sources, and you can build apps on the top of it. And then with CDS, using the Power Platform, you can build external facing websites using the Power Apps portals, where you can configure logins for external users, people from within your organization, or people with whom you share the access for this particular web portal that you build. And field level security can be implemented on this, along with customizing it to bring data from other data sources as well. And then you can create internal apps to talk to the CDS data, which can be a Canvas app or it can be a model-driven app. And we've seen a lot of sessions throughout the entire day on how to do that. And we can also create visualizations and interactive reports using Power BI on the top of CDS, and creating relational data, bringing data from multiple data sources and creating those relationships within Power BI itself. And then lastly, let's see how you can use CDS as a data store at the one-point data platform using data flows. So let's take a quick look at what data flows can do. So for this demo, I have a SharePoint list. I'll be creating that from scratch and show you how we can get data from a SharePoint list to CDS entities. So let's get started with that. I'll quick create a new list over here on SharePoint, and name it as client request. So let's assume that I have an application built on the top of this SharePoint list, where my team members are interacting with the app, and the data is getting stored over here on the SharePoint list called as client requests. On this list, I'll be storing data like the concern that a client has recorded. And I'll have a single line of text column where I'll save the name of a client. I'll add one more column of type choice where I'm going to state the status of their request. So right now we have these three columns over here where we are recording the client request details and then the name and the status. So this app particularly, which will be built on the top of this SharePoint list, will be able to record this data. But then let's assume we also have an app that is working on top of SQL as a database and recording some other details, for example, like what the customer or what this client has purchased from us. And then we might have another app sitting on another data source, such as Excel, where we are recording data like which area or which region this particular client is from, their shipping details, their address, and all those other details. But let's look at how we are going to bring this particular list data to a CDS entity. And before doing that, I'll quickly add some fake data over here. So I believe this much should be enough for us for now. So now we have our data on the list over here. So let's go ahead and create corresponding entities on CDS and bring this data using data flows. So I'll come here to entities and create an entity. While we're creating these entities, I'll be having two entities in CDS, one for the client name and the other is for the client request that they are logging. So as you can see here in our SharePoint list, we have the client name as a single line of text field. But in CDS, we are creating an entity so that we can look up from the client request entity to the client name entity and reference these clients directly from there. And then we'll have the title, which will go into the request for that particular customer or the client request. And we'll store the status as a status reason for the request entity. So our client name entity has been created now. I can go ahead and add some data here first. So now we have all the three customers that we have on our SharePoint list created over here. So I'll quickly refresh this and we can see our customer A, B, and C. Now that we want to map this to a lookup, we will be creating a key so that it can be recognized in our data flow. So this will all make sense once we are creating the data flow as well. So I'll just quick create a key over here. And then save the entity. So the customer client name entity has been created for us now. I'll go back to the entities and create a new one for logging the requests. And in this entity, we'll be creating a lookup for our client. And another field, or maybe just this, because we'll be saving the request on the name field itself and save this entity. Now we have this entity created for storing the client request, but we are yet to configure the status reasons for each of the individual statuses that we have on the SharePoint list. So I'll go back to the entities over here and maybe go to the solutions first. So I have the client request entity over here, and we are going to configure the status reasons for our individual statuses that we have on our SharePoint list as well. So let's do that first. It's taking a little bit to load. So yeah, here it is. We are looking for the status code field. This cannot be directly edited from the modern view right now. So that's why we are switching to the classic view and editing this. While this is loading, I'll just grab what statuses we have here: in progress, solved, and canceled. So we'll be replicating the same. The aim here is to get the data from our SharePoint list and tie it over here in CDS so that we can get the data from multiple data sources as well. So under the status active, we have the status reason active over here. So we'll just modify this. And let's say I'll name this as in progress. And I'll add one more for solved. And another one for cancel, and save this. So the trick here is that when we are updating this in the data flow, it expects us to provide the actual value, which is the number that is provided over here. So we'll just copy this and save it so that it is easier for us while creating the data flow. And then lastly, for our in progress status here. So now this is clear. So we'll just save and close. So once this is saved and closed, we have our entity created, and I'll go ahead and publish all the customizations that we just did. It's taking a little while. So while this is happening, we are saving the status reason so that we can identify the status from the SharePoint list as well of what the current status is for this particular request that our client has created. Now let's go ahead to Power Apps and start creating our data flow. So as you can see here, we are on make.powerapps.com, and on data flows, I can come here and create a data flow. So I'll create a new data flow and name it as sync data with SharePoint. And here I can identify the data source from where I want to get the data and sync into CDS. So since we're getting it from the SharePoint list, I'll select the SharePoint list connector over here. And as you can see, it's expecting me to provide the site URL and connection details. So first I'll go ahead and create a new connection. Or rather, I'll just go ahead and provide the site URL so that it creates the connection for me. And I'll provide the authentication kind as Microsoft account so that I can sign in. And it pops up me with this authenticator so that I can sign in and authenticate my credentials to use the data flow and get the data from the SharePoint list. So once we are authenticated, I can go ahead and select next. All right, so it's taking more than expected right now. So let's just give this another few seconds. All right, so now that it is connected, it is going to get me the list of, get all the lists that are there on my SharePoint list. So I'm going to select the client request and then hit the transform data. In this transform data, here is where we're going to use Power Query to transform the data a little bit and match to what we want on CDS. So as you can see, it has loaded all the rows that we have in our SharePoint list for each client and the status values and the name of the request or what the request has been created. So what we want to do now is I'll select transform and select the add a column, and I'll add a conditional column over here first. So I want to do this conditional column primarily because I have the status value fields over here in my CDS that is expecting a number to be provided, while what I'm getting from SharePoint is a label. So I'm going to match those. And here I'm going to select the status value. Let's first name this as status value from SP. And here I'm going to select the status value, and equals. I'm going to select the items that I have over there in SharePoint. So let's go and add in progress first. So if it is in progress, I want it to match the value as 1 and return that as an output. And then again, add another clause where the status value is equal to solved, and then return the value as this number. And then finally for our cancel status, so I'll again select the status value here and check if it is cancelled. So this is going to return these respective values based upon the status in the SharePoint list. As you can see, it automatically creates the query for us and then adds the column. So as you can see here, we have these from this SharePoint, and based on that, it has computed these values. So we had one item for in progress, one item as cancelled, and one item as solved, which we can see here. And then we'll also add another custom column over here. So this custom column is going to be for our for the lookup ID that we have. I'll name this as the client name. All right, just give me a second. So I think we can do it directly over here. Just I'm looking for this right now. So maybe let's go ahead and see what it does right now, and then we'll come back for the client name. So I'll go ahead and click next. So since we have our status values over here. And here I can either create a new entity or load into an existing entity. So as we have already created the customer request entity or the client request entity, we'll directly load it into that. And I'll select the load into existing entity and select the customer request entity that I have created, which is client request. And for the field mapping, I'm going to select the client name. So as you can see, it has detected the key directly over here so that we didn't have to create another column for that. And I'm going to add the client name over here. And then for the request, I'm going to directly add the title from the SharePoint list, which is going to go to the concern that the client has raised. And then I'll click next. So there are two types of refresh settings that I can configure for a data flow. One could be refreshed manually, and then the other one is refreshed automatically. So we can just go ahead and do refresh manually first and see what happens. It's taking a little while here, so please bear with it right now. And I can see the data flow created over here with this name. And I can see the last refresh time and the next refresh over here. So right now, I'll just go ahead and refresh it. So it's in progress now. So while this is refreshing, a few things about data flows. In one environment, whatever data flows you have, it can be owned by a single person only. Data flows cannot be shared amongst users in the organization. And the data from this data flow can be routed to a CDS entity, or it can directly be opened to into a Power BI file so that you can visualize the data and analyze it. And as you can see, it shows that the last refresh has happened at this point, and the next refresh is not scheduled because we don't have a scheduled refresh for this. So I can select this and I can click refresh. So it triggers the data flow manually, and I can also see the refresh history. So let's go ahead and see the refresh history here of what happened with our refresh that we did. And it says that, okay, this is of type on demand, and it took 16 seconds for this data flow to complete, and the status is succeeded. So I can download this file, which is of form Excel, and it shows me what happened on the data query or on the data flow. So as you can see, it provides me with this data and says that, there were 3 rows that have been added to the CDS. And if there was a data flow which had the status as failed, you can still download this file and see that at what point the data flow has failed and what were the reasons for it. So now that it has succeeded, we'll go ahead and see the data that has been created. So as you can see, it has copied all the data from our SharePoint list over here to our CDS entity. And then in the data flow itself, we can add more settings so that we can sync it appropriately with the data source that we want to. So one of such is, let's see the Power Query part again. Where we are mapping entities, it provides us with an option to delete rows that no longer exist in the query output. So for example, if I had some data on my SharePoint list, and then this data flow is running continuously to save this data on our CDS database. So for example, if there was something updated on SharePoint and it does not exist in this query that is returning more data from our SharePoint list, so it is going to directly delete those items. And this can be used for detecting if there are any previous items that are in the SharePoint, if they are in the CDS and they don't have to be there. So it is going to delete those rows and keep it in sync with the latest data on our SharePoint list. And then apart from this, we saw how to do a manual refresh data flow. So we can edit the settings, edit refresh settings over here and make it run on a schedule also. So let's see that part. if I select refresh automatically over here, I can select, let's say 5 minutes, and I can provide a start date and time on when it should start refreshing. So this can be done on schedule and it will keep refreshing based on that. So let's say I'll put just 1 minute over here. So it has updated the refresh settings for this, and now it's going to automatically automatically trigger the data flow and refresh between SharePoint and CDS. So I'll go ahead and add one more line over here. This time I'll write customer D and see what happens on our data flow. So as you can see, it says the next refresh is scheduled at 8:01. So we'll just do it, override that and do it manually. And I'll go back to see what the refresh history is over here. So it says again, it has succeeded at 8:09. So let's see what action or what it has. So it says again 3 over here. So I'll just wait until it is doing it again. So as you can see, it's running now. And if I refresh data over here, so it's added those 3 rows again because we didn't select the checkbox to delete the items which are coming as an output or the new items which are coming from the SharePoint list. Um, let's see one of the in progress items. So it's not returning any data here. I want to show how it returns details when there's a failed query. All right, show refresh history. So it says there's a warning over here on the status. So let's go ahead and see what that is. And as you can see, it could not resolve the GUID for the client name because it's like we just have 3 customer IDs in our customer request entity, which is customer A, B, and C. And this time I took customer D, which is not existing in our customer's entity. So it is not able to find that. And it is unable to reference to that particular lookup to update in our or in our client request entity over here. So as you can see, it provides you with the details of the error where it is where if there's any single record or a single item that is causing an issue, and that can be fixed and the data flow can be rerun so that the data gets in sync. So apart from the data flows over here, there's another way of syncing data from the CDS. So we can also use data lake, which I currently cannot demo because it's on my other account, and it's on my other account, and this tenant does not allow me to have another Azure account over here. So let's go ahead and see our data now. So it's continuously getting those items and adding each of them individually, one after the other, based on what it is getting from the SharePoint list. So I'll just go ahead and modify this a little bit. So this time I'm going to select this option to delete the rows that no longer exist in the query output and go next. And change it to refresh manually this time so that it is not overloading with the data flows. And I'll manually do a refresh now. One of the main catches about data flows is you can use the transform data tool and use Power Query to structure the data as you want. So for example, if you were having choice type columns or lookup type columns, and then if you wanted to split some data into different columns, you can do that using the Power Query on the transform data itself. So let's look at the refresh that has happened now. And I'll refresh this data here. So as you can see, it is going to delete all those items which were not there from the SharePoint and create these new items over here. And then using data flows, you can also add data to multiple entities. You can create new entity. You can add data to an existing entity that we just did. And it has other benefits such as, you can have multiple data sources. So let me quickly run through what all data sources are supported at the moment over here. So as you can see, there's a bunch of connectors that are directly available, which can be used to create a data flow and get data from other sources and pull it into CDS. So multiple data flows can be created, and it can be used to populate different fields on a particular entity. So to give a broader example, I would have a client's entity or a customer's entity over here in CDS where I'm storing the data of individual customers. And then I can have another entity, which is the client requests that I already have. And right now, I'm just storing the client concerns that they have raised related to their orders. But as mentioned before, I was having another app which was running on top of a SQL database that was getting the details of what the customer has actually ordered. So I can link that back over here and have it on one entity only, and then read that data into Power BI to better visualize all these systems together and put the data into CDS. So this was about how you can create data flows. I'll come back to my presentation where I have a few more slides to cover. And let's do a quick recap of what did we learn in the past 30 minutes or so. So creating data flows was the main outcome of this session. And then we also understand how to use Power Query and transform data. So if I was getting a specific type of column data, like a choice or a lookup, I can map that. I can create the Power Query or can transform the data in a way that it can load appropriately into CDS the way we want it to be. And then how we can load the data into an entity from a SharePoint list. So as a test and trial and learn, we can also test this out with other data sources like Excel or SQL and something like that. And we also saw how we can configure refresh policies for data flows. So it could be a manual refresh that we can perform, or we can do it on a particular assigned schedule. So for example, if we were having a customer ordering system where we are managing the entire customer service on a CDS database, we can set this data flows to refresh every 24 hours so that we can get all the data across all the systems and then push it to CDS at once and refresh the Power BI in a way where it creates those visualizations. And then we also saw how we can see or debug errors and warnings and issues that are that pop up once a data flow has completed refreshing, and we can see which data has been added over there, what was the row count of the data that was extracted from the other data source and the other data source and pushed into the CDS. So these are the few things that we saw in the demo today. And then what is next from this? So as a trial, we can see how we can create an on-prem database. Maybe the best example for this would be using an Access DB table, because Access database allows you to directly connect to the CDS using a direct connector and create linked tables, so that all your tables that you have created in the Access DB are linked to the tables that you create in CDS, and the data is refreshed on a real-time basis. And then we can also see how we can understand this access and CDS database. So one which was about the linked tables. The second is how you can create data flows. So there's again a direct connector for creating a data flow between access and CDS, but however, it creates the SharePoint list first and routes your data through there. And then what is Azure Data Lake? So apart from data flows, you can also create a storage account in Azure and enable the data lake property for that, so that all the data from CDS can be pushed to that data lake. It saves the data in the form of a CSV, so that CSV can be further used to import data in other data sources. And then there's a Power BI report that you can create from the Azure Data Lake data directly, or you can use the Power Query using the query editor and then get this data in Power BI and visualize it appropriately. So I'll just quickly look at the questions now. So this is one directional only, cannot be used for bidirectional. Yes, so it is one direction only, it cannot be bidirectional. And then can we use data flows to connect? Oh, yes, we can connect using on-prem as well. And so yes, we can do with Power Automate. We cannot. We can do with. There are multiple ways of doing this, but then the query editor that I've shown, where we were able to transform the data, so it is done much more easier than compared to Power Automate. That is one. And both of the methods have their own pros and cons that can be done. So it entirely depends upon the scenario or the use case that we are trying to build. So I believe we cannot export data flows directly just yet. So I'll have to go back and check on that once. And I can probably open the floor for a few questions for the next 5 minutes, because I just have one more thing to complete before the questions are completed. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. So in terms of performance, I think data flows perform much better because it's quite fast compared to Power Automate flows. And again, it would entirely depend upon the scenario that we're trying to build. So limits for data flows. I mean, the limitations is exactly, I don't really have the exact number as per how many data records that it can push on a single go, but it definitely is much more powerful as a tool compared to the other methods that we already have. We can get data from on-prem connector as well. And there's a question on SSIS data migration. I'm not entirely sure of that. So I'll quickly check that and get back to you on that one. All right, so I think we are short of questions over here. So I have one quick activity, which is called as Question Palooza, that I have created for this event. So right now, I mean, most events that have been happening in person, like a couple of months ago, we used to have these questions that the speakers would ask at the end of the session, such that to understand, you know, how the attendees have grasped the knowledge of the session, and then we distribute prizes based on that. But I don't have any material prizes right now, and as a reward for the Question Palooza winners, I can work with you on one problem that you have been facing on the Power Platform personally with you and guide you on that. So that's the reward for the Question Palooza. And then the second rule is I'm going to ask two questions over here, and the first person who answers them in the chat wins the question and wins the opportunity for that. So my first question here is, based on the session, what would be the minimum time that you can set for a scheduled refresh on a data flow? All right, so that was fast, and we have Sabrish here who is we have Sabrish here who has won this one. But guys who have answered, please feel free to reach out. I'll try my level best to help you out with your queries on the Power Platform issues that you've been facing. So the second question that I have here is, hang on. So let me check my second question here. So the second question I have here is, how can you prevent duplicating data from a data flow? That's correct, Aarti. So you are on the second one. So I believe we have our two winners over here. So before moving to the next part of the session, I wanted to see of other methods and other ways that we can pass on data from CDS and consider it as a sink. So we see that we can create Power Automate flows and get data from multiple data sources, and it can be used. It can be used to sync data on the CDS. Apart from this, there's also the Azure Data Factory that can be used. So Azure Data Factory can be used to get data from CDS, and you can create multiple pipelines that run on different triggers, maybe using an Azure Function app or maybe a scheduled trigger. And you can get the data from the CDS and spit it out into a SQL server or into other databases that it can create as a central repository where you can create multiple applications on the top of this. And there was one more question on how we can configure these data flows, or what are the other methods. So data flows is one that we saw. Then there is the Azure Data Factory, and then there is Power Automate that we can do. And also, apart from this, you can also use the Excel extension for the CDS entities. You can download the Excel file from the CDS for that particular entity and sync data directly. All right. Any questions on that so far?
Hi, Ash. Sabrish.
Hey.
Yeah.
Hey. Yep.
Hello. Sorry. Quick question. So, are there any API? Does the sync count towards the API limits? I know Microsoft have been very rigorously checking how the platform is being used. So, if there's a lot of activity sync happening, does it count towards the API limits introduced on the platform?
It does count to the API limits and the throttling. So it does take into consideration of the number of requests that that are being sent to the other data source and back to the CDS.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thank you.
All right. So one more question that I have that I can ask you guys. So while creating a data flow using the Azure Data Lake, which type of storage account that you have to create on Azure? And answer on the chat, please. Yes, that's correct. So I have another candidate here, Sabrish. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I think this was pretty much that I had on the data flows. Yeah.
Hi, Yash.
Hey.
Thank you very much for the session. I have a question. How to ensure that the data won't be duplicated in CDS? Meaning, if
yeah, go ahead.
So if I have an account in CDS and I have updates comes from another data source, how to be sure that I updated the account without creating duplicated data?
So as you can see, while we were configuring the data flow over here, so we had a checkbox that was enabled to ignore the items which were not coming as a part of the query and delete those. So I'll just quickly show that as well. So upon checking this checkbox, it is not going to add any other items which are not there on the data source already from the source of, from the source where the data is coming from. All right, guys, coming back to my PPT. So thank you so much for attending the session. I hope you've learned something about the data flows, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions on the same. I'll try as much as I can to help you with those. So over to Raz here.
Thank you so much again, Yash.
Yep.
Once again, thank you very much for that excellent session on data flows. Can everybody hear? And does
so much for
anybody have any
providing me with the
questions?
opportunity to present here.
Thank you so much again. For those who would like to follow Yash, please remember to contact him and follow him on your connection details. If you could share them in the chat, that would be great. It's very late in Hyderabad right now, so thank you, Yash, and thank you, Ritika, for obviously joining us all the way from India. It's very late there right now, so I want to thank you once again for joining us. Does anybody have any extra questions related to the session presented by Yash on CDS data flows? So Sunita and Sefa are saying thank you very much, Yash. They're very happy with your session. Does anybody else have any questions?
Raz, I'll ask one question to Yash. This is Narayan.
Hey, Narayan.
Hi, Yash. Have you come across two issues? Like, first one, Swagger limit has reached. And in that kind of situation, what would you do? So that's one. And the second thing is, what are the limits on the nested if condition in flow?
In the data flow?
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure on the number.
Okay.
Yeah.
That should be fine. But have you come across any issues like Swagger API limit has reached?
So it's like I'm not entirely sure on that as well, because the most records that I have tried using data flow were not more than like 1,500 or so. So I'm guessing it's because of the number of records that are coming in.
It could be. Yeah, you're right. Because I'm checking on the situation where, like, passing from, and that's why we're getting some issues with that. So when we removed more than 4 nested, it started working absolutely fine. So I was a bit surprised that, like, it's a 4 nested or 3 nested loop, nested ifs causing this trouble. There might be some sorts of limit, or I'm doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yes. So does anybody have any other questions related to that? Data flows are relatively new. Bit of technology in the Power Platform, and obviously the number of use cases. It's great to see obviously the use cases and how people are using data flows in which scenarios. So it'd be really cool to see the scenarios in which data flows are being used.
Yes, Raj. So to add one more thing to Narayan's questions, I'm sure that it also depends upon what data source we are using. Most times it accommodates Excel nicely compared to other data sources. So I would also check that to debug further. And yeah.
Sorry, what was that, Yash?
Yeah, I was just continuing on your thought over here about how or what would be the use cases of data flow. So one such situation or one such application that we are using right now is we have a entire end-to-end customer monitoring and management system where we are having customers coming and buying stuff from one of our web pages. So the data over there is stored on a SQL Server database. And then we have internal agents who are monitoring these issues that are being raised by customers. And this data is coming from like multiple data sources. It is SharePoint and Excel basically. So there are Power Apps built on top of SharePoint where they're tracking those individual requests of the customers. And it is also being logged through our Power Apps portal, which is live. And then there's a virtual agent from where a customer is logging their issues that they're facing. And based on that, we are pushing all the data together into the CDS and then analyzing that on where or which area most issues are coming from and what is the product line from where most issues are coming from and things like that.
Great stuff. Yes, sounds like a really interesting scenario. Really looking forward to actually using it in some really good use cases. So yes, sounds really good. And thank you so much for sharing that gold nugget there with us, Yash, today. Always sharing the latest and greatest use cases with us, Yash. So thank you again for your great session. Does anybody else have any final questions before Yash leaves us? Okay, so again, yeah, please, Yash, please feel free to share your contact details in the window in the chat before you leave, so that people can get in touch with yourself, follow your blog, follow you on Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on and so forth. And I want to thank you.